Hi everybody, it's Dr. Mack at Pacific East Aquaculture. I'm out in the greenhouse here. It's early morning in Maryland. Sun's just coming up. I wanted to talk a little bit more about our clams, our cultured clams. So we get in cultured clams from Tonga, French Polynesia, and Palau. We get in maximas, occasionally duraces, and squamosas from Tonga, from French Polynesia, and that's these right here. And from French Polynesia, we get in maximas, which are the only clams that occur in French Polynesia. And occasionally we'll get some in from Palau, and those are like the teardrops and the croceas. Here's a couple of them right here. There's a teardrop on the left and a tiger crocea on the right. Now we get less of those. The clam farms in Palau and Tonga are run by the government, so it's a little bit less consistent as to the availability, at least for us. And the farm in French Polynesia, I went over there about 10 or 12 years ago and helped set that up, and that's privately held, so generally the clams are more regularly available from there. And generally they're a little bit larger, and just naturally they're brighter because the clams from that area are a lot brighter, as you can see from some of these. Some of them aren't all open in this bin right now. It's just kind of moving things around and reorganizing, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the things we hear from folks about clams. So number one is feeding. The clams predominantly use the products of photosynthesis as food. So as much light as you can get them, the better. They do not need to be supplementally fed, so the whole thing with feeding phytoplankton, that's fine if you want to do it, but the clams really don't need it. Even some of these are in the 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 inch size, and they really don't need supplemental feeding. Now we do feed heavily every day in our tanks, and that's mostly for the corals, but we're not feeding supplements for the clams. And if you have a lot of fish in the tank and you feed them well, you're going to have some dissolved organics in there, and the clams do utilize that as well. So if you have some nitrates, phosphates in the water, the clams will do quite well in your tank. They adapt very well to various types of lighting. As I said, we keep them out here in our greenhouse. We have some inside under LEDs. We've kept some under LEDs for over 4 and 5 years in some of our display tanks over the years. So they seem to be quite adaptable to different types of lighting, unlike the wild collected clams. So we don't deal with any wild collected clams any longer. We did years ago when I first went to French Polynesia, and I was collecting them myself along with my partner over there. But in recent years, he's decided to collect more fish and turn over the collection of the clams to local divers. And they collect them for food. These clams are used for food there. You can go in the grocery store and buy a bag of Maxima clam meat, and it's used as food. And when they collect them for food, they're not very gentle with them. And the clams in the wild do have a parasite called Perkensis. These cultured clams do not. They've been tested. They're in a segregated area, and they do not have the parasite. So the wild collected clams, when you tear them off the rock, you damage the foot, and they're shipped dry from the remote islands to Tahiti, because they don't actually occur around Tahiti. They're found in the remote islands by the hundreds of millions in French Polynesia, and they ship them dry from there. So between the stress of the collection and the shipping to Tahiti and then shipping them to the US or wherever around the world really stresses that clam and allows that parasite to take over. And so that's why you'll see after a month or two the mantle gets pinched and they basically are just wasting away and dying. So I don't recommend the wild collected clams, and any clam you see available for sale over about 3 inches or so is a wild collected clam, because it just takes too long to grow these cultured ones to be able to economically sell them much larger than about 3 inches, 3.5 inches maybe at the maximum. Most of these that we get are around 1.25 to 2.5, maybe 3 inches. The Polynesian ones tend to be a little bit larger. These ones from Tonga tend to be a little bit smaller. Another thing is there are several different types of clams. So there's Duraces, Squamosas, Maximas, Croceas. We also get teardrop clams, and most commonly we get the Maximas, occasionally Squamosas, occasionally Duraces, and relatively uncommon now are the Croceas. I found that they're all equally hardy in captivity with the cultured ones, unlike the wild ones. So in the past, with wild collected clams, the Duraces and Squamosas would be considered the easiest to keep, whereas nowadays the cultured clams are all equally hardy. Let me talk a little bit about the foot as well. When we get them in, they're not usually attached to anything, like this little guy here from Tonga. And the foot is this fleshy part right inside here. And folks talk a lot about the foot being torn and that type of thing. So the foot is where the clam attaches to a hard surface. And they want to attach to a hard surface. So on the top, where the mantle, the fleshy part of the clam is that we see as the colored area, when the clam closes up, obviously that mantle is protected. But underneath, the clam can't close that area up. It can retract it like it just did now when I picked it up, but it can't completely close that. So it's vulnerable in that area. And so they want to attach to something firm to prevent that from being vulnerable from pests or predators. So they want to attach to something firm. If you put them on the sand bed, you want to put some rock underneath that. If you put them up on the rock work, you want to make sure they're up in an area where they can't fall over. So this is what it looks like when they're trying to attach. And they send out threads. And if you could see these sort of mucus-like threads that they send out and attach to the rock rubble or rock, or like if you put them on a clam cradle or something like that, you could see the threads there. Occasionally I'll drop this off and move to a different area. And so you'll see this little fleshy portion with the threads on there and maybe a little bit of rubble. And oftentimes folks will contact us in a panic that the clam has dropped its foot. Well, it actually hasn't dropped the foot, it's actually dropped that tissue that it was trying to attach to the rubble with. And the clam is perfectly fine. So here you could see the foot a little bit more closely on this clam. It's kind of a ruffled surface there. And that's normally what it looks like. So if it's torn, you're actually tearing a large part of that clam. And usually once they're torn, truly torn, they're probably not going to survive because you've really damaged the internal part of that clam. And again, really to really truly tear them, you'd have to really rip them off some type of a substrate. And that's why we keep them on this rubble, because then they're easy to ship. And usually a lot of this will just, when we go to pick them up to ship them, will usually just fall right off without damaging the clam. So we're usually pretty careful about handling them, especially in this vulnerable area, the foot area. Again, they do not need to be fed specifically. If it makes you feel good to put some phytoplankton there, it probably won't hurt things. You could feed some of the corals that way, but the clams really don't need to be fed. They're very hardy. They're easy to keep, in my experience, under a variety of lighting. Just make sure that you don't have any fish in there that are going to pester them, and usually most, quote, reef-safe type fish are good with the clams. Occasionally you'll get some wrasses and even some tangs and maybe some of the pygmy angels that may go up to them and kind of nip at the mantle, but generally most of the traditional reef-safe fish are just fine with the clams. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me and check out our website at pacificeastaquaculture.com. Take care.